Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Radical Candor podcast. I'm Jason Rosoff.
I'm Amy Sandler, and today, Jason, I'm going to check in with you. You have been cooking up a new product, and I am eager to hear about how you've gotten to where you're at now and where you're going with this product, and most of all, how this is going to help our podcast audience.
Yeah, excited to share with you and with our intrepid listeners. So, Radical Candor is building a community, an online community to help aspiring and experienced people leaders stress less, build better relationships, and get more done by connecting each of you with your peers, with experts in the Radical Candor community, and offering resources to make your jobs and lives easier through the application of Radical Candor. So, a lot of the things that you listen to the podcast for, tips and tricks, but a way to actually interact with other folks who are on their Radical Candor journey, as well as along with experts like Kim and Amy and myself and Brandy, who will all be part of the community too.
Cool. So just if I'm hearing you and just to reframe, like if I'm someone, I'm listening to the podcast, I can access the content and I'm just kind of having my own experience with the content. But this is a chance for people to actually start to connect with each other, other folks who are fans of Radical Candor, and then actually get some practice time as well as some real-time events. Is that an accurate summary?
Yeah, I would say that that's even more detailed than I was trying to be. So, like the idea of this community is to create a space for development. One of the things that we often hear from people who write into the podcast, for example, is like that they don't really have someone else that they can talk to about whatever management challenge it is that they're trying to overcome, and they're inspired by the ideas of Radical Candor. And so they reach out to us and say, "Hey, could you help? Can you help? I have this situation. I really don't know how to deal with it." And what we realized is like we can answer a vanishingly few, small number of those questions that people send to us, and wouldn't it be great if there was a place where people could hear from us, but maybe even more importantly, hear from each other about how they might apply the ideas of Radical Candor to solve their management challenges. So that's like one of the key pieces of inspiration. And there's a bunch of ways that we're imagining that people will be able to do this. So one way is through peer coaching, right? So you can share your question or your story with somebody and ask if they have guidance. Another way is through like expert coaching or guidance. So maybe you ask your question and a Radical Candor expert would answer it. Like maybe I would see your question and I would send you an answer electronically. And then we might also do things like live coaching sessions or interactive sessions or sort of workshops, however you want to think about it, where we hold, an hour once a month or something for people to come and share a particular experience and to receive some guidance. So we're playing with all of those things. And then in addition to that, through the community will be available all of the really great content that we've built over time that's kind of scattered all over the place right now. We have some on the website and the blog, some is in social media, some are baked into podcast episodes. We want to make all of that super easy to find and accessible in the same place. So like I'm imagining, for example, someone says, "Hey, I read the really great blog post that Brandy wrote about how to avoid falling into obnoxious aggression when you're trying to apply Radical Candor. But I still have a question about this. In the blog post, Brandy says, blah, blah, blah. Here's the challenge I'm having with that. How could I do it?" We might see that, or community members might see that, and hopefully we could start a discussion and give more people the kind of benefit that some folks get right now when they write into the podcast with questions and they get a detailed set of suggestions. I'm hoping to replicate that for more people.
That's great. Yeah. And really also thinking about folks that might be able to ask those questions with their peers during a workshop with a coach, a facilitator. Now we're really broadening that. I, of course, am biased. I'm super excited about this. And the demand for this, one of the things, Jason, that I thought would be helpful is to share with our listeners, like how do you even think about a project like this? Like like using this podcast not only to get people excited to learn more about the community and to hear what you would like to see in it, but also just to look at kind of how do you run a project successfully. So right now we're at July 8th. So could you walk us through kind of your timeline so far, like what you've done in terms of kicking off the project and research, setting goals, et cetera? Just kind of walk us through project management 101, 201, however much you want to go into it.
Yeah. So we have to rewind to the beginning of the year. We didn't start out with the intention of building a community. Instead, we started with a goal, which was to build, to offer an opportunity for ongoing learning of radical candor. And that was one goal. And there was another goal, which was to build new revenue streams, new non-facilitated revenue streams for the company. And it was
Hmm.
really those two goals that wound up leading us to this idea of building a community. I would like to say that there was a grand plan, and I always knew this was what was going to happen. But it really started out with like setting those intentions. That's how the project began. And the first set of things that I did were,
Well, actually, and Jason, let me pause on that because I think
yeah,
there's some really interesting learning there for folks. So,
yeah.
like, how did you, when you had these two goals, like, can you break down in some more detail, like, what were the steps you were taking looking at those two goals, and how did you tie those two goals together? Because I could imagine there's other folks out there who are doing, looking at their goals and that step from when you realize like, oh, these things could be related, or, sort of what was that creative spark that lit up for you?
Yeah, so perfect segue. What that led to was me scratching my head and having kind of no idea exactly how to accomplish it. And instead, what I did was I started to think about, what are some things we could try.
Hmm.
And there were a handful of things in this bucket of things we could try. One of them that we could try, because it wasn't sure it was going to work, is we could reach out to the community. So we actually launched a survey in, I think, February or March of this year, asking people what kinds of learning experiences were they looking for or most excited by this year. And we said, just don't forget radical candor, but like just think broadly. Like, what are the kinds of experiences that you're looking for? So that was one of the things that we wanted to try, was to see, could we gather a significant amount of data from the community to get some insight that way. The other things we decided to try were, let's run some experiments. So, like on the continuous learning front, we had some ideas of some technological tools or solutions that we could try to put into place with our corporate clients to see if we could get some traction there. This challenge of how do you ensure that the learning that happens inside of a workshop really sticks is a perennial one.
Hmm.
Anybody who teaches anything knows that these sort of moment in time learning experiences, they all, significant portions of what we hear and what we think we've internalized slip away in the hours, let alone weeks and months after one of those sessions concludes. And we really care about people effectively applying radical candor. And so we were like, what could we give to clients that would make it easy for them to operationalize this idea of continuous learning? And so we had a couple of product-y ideas there. And I had a couple of partners. So we weren't going to build them ourselves, but I had a couple of partners that I'd been talking to about this stuff. And I said, okay, we're going to try all three. We're going to try three things. We're going to try two product ideas, and we're going to run this survey. And we got interesting results. And the idea of the product experiments was to put them in the hands of a few clients and start getting feedback from them. And the results of all of those things were sort of interesting. One of the things that we realized is that the products without a clear purpose, meaning without a sort of guiding, an underlying emotional reason to use them, we're not going to be complete solutions. So the two things that I'm referring to, one of them is a conversational practice tool that actually allows you to have simulated conversations using AI. And we've imbued the AI with some common scenarios that people run into. So, like someone who thinks they're ready for a promotion, but they're not actually ready,
Mhm.
is an example of that. You can actually try to have that conversation with the bot, and it's really like it's quite hard, very quite challenging. And at the end of it, you get this really great feedback about how well you've applied the principles of radical candor to that conversation. So that was one of the product ideas. And the other one was this sort of like drip campaign on steroids, is the way that I like to think about it, which means we would send out some content reminders to people who had gone through a workshop. But the really cool part about this was it wasn't static. This was also backed by AI. So, like, instead of just a prompt that says, hey, maybe you should be thinking about your go to question. Listeners of the podcast will know what we mean when we say
Mhm.
go to question. Um, Maybe you should be thinking about your go to question. What's your go to question and who are you going to ask it? And instead of that being a static prompt, it was actually interactive. So, like, you would tell the
Mhm.
AI, here's my go to question, and here's who I intend to ask. And the AI could give you some feedback on that. So, those were our two product ideas. And then the survey was this sort of in depth exploration of various different
Yep.
modalities of learning and types of learning experiences, like courses, sort of like asynchronous courses versus live learning experiences versus webinars. And then we also asked about topic areas. So, would you like to learn more about how to build strong teams or how to get shit done? We asked a whole bunch of questions. So, those are the three. Those are the three experiments. We said we're going to try each of these things, and we're going to see how people respond.
Well, I think it's great. And first of all, if you are someone who answered the survey and shared your perspective, thank you so much. It really does make a difference. Obviously, we want to give folks things that are going to be valuable. So, Jason, just to repeat back what I heard, and for those of you who might be starting out with something like for me, I know when I have a really big project, I can sometimes get overwhelmed, and it can be so helpful. One of the things I think you do really well is like breaking it down into those smaller pieces. So what I heard you say was, okay, I had these two really big goals. And so what I did was I figured out like what experiments I could start doing. So actually doing some product experiments.
Yep.
And the other thing was getting some real research, some real data to work with. Is that an accurate summary of what you sort of how you were thinking about that?
It is, and I'm going to yes and you to say the idea of the product experiments was to generate more data. So the goal was not to sell $1
Gotcha.
million at that point, right? The goal was generate some data about how and whether these experiences are actually producing either the learning result that we want or seem to indicate they could produce the revenue result that we're looking for, right? Like we had both of those questions. And what I was saying was the reason I described the products is because I was trying to say something sort of abstract, which is that the results of these experiments were really interesting, that the using the products on their own without some sort of like motivating wrapper around them was just insufficient, right? People weren't going to use this entirely on their own. And it wasn't always the type of help people needed. You know what I'm saying? Like
Mm-hmm.
sometimes it was great to be able to practice a conversation. And sometimes it was great to be reminded of a core idea of radical candor and even to get feedback on, for example, how to ask a great go-to question. It was very hard to time those things in a way that like
Mm-hmm.
really made an impact on people. And then when we got the results of the survey and combined it with those two product experiments, it sort of started to make sense because the results of the survey were very clear. People were looking for tools and tactics, like very specific tools
Mm-hmm.
and guidance. But the way they said that they learned how to apply those things was in community with other people, right? That they were looking for that the best experiences, we asked people about the best experience that they've had learning something new. And universally the best experience was learning with other people. Like everybody talked about an experience learning with other humans. There was no like, oh, I'm learning this thing on my own. I think especially because we're radical candor, so we're primed to be talking about management and communication, which are these fundamentally relational
Yeah.
activities. Everybody's like, oh, the way you learn that is by working with other humans. Makes sense. And when we talked about the things that people were excited to pay for, right? Like what were people laying down their own money for? We were asking about your personal professional development. Like what were you going to
Mm-hmm.
spend your money on this year? And the answer there was the same, which is like I'm looking for the opportunity to connect with peers and experts who can help me figure out how to apply complex or like really useful guidance to complex real world problems. And so people were talking about going on retreats and doing live seminars and doing workshops and things like that. And so the combination of these experiences really got me thinking, like, maybe there is a way to bring all of this together, right? Maybe the tools and the community and the learning, like that connection to your peers and all this other, like maybe there's a way for all of that to happen together. And it was really in response to those experiments, that's where the spark or the insight came
Mm-hmm.
from, was seeing how people responded to the sort of naive ways that we were approaching it at first. And once it was kind of like one of those things, Amy, you and I talked about this as we were going through this process, where as soon as we came up with the idea of building the community, it was sort of like obvious in retrospect. It was like, oh, duh, like that was clear, like
Yeah.
it's clearly a thing that should exist. And to me, that's actually a really good sign from a product development perspective. When you get to the idea and you're like, oh, it's almost like mundane. The answer is like
Mm-hmm.
very simple, and it's sort of smacking us in the face. Like it should have been obvious to us all along. That's actually a good sign, not a bad sign. That doesn't mean that you did anything wrong. It means that you're probably closer to the truth. I'm not saying we've actually gotten it right here, but we're probably closer to the truth than if we had come up with some very complex or convoluted thing. They were like, I never imagined this thing could
Yeah.
possibly exist in the world. That's usually a sign that you've maybe over-engineered a solution to a problem.
Well, I think that is such a helpful, sort of reminder for folks, and also just hearing you explain how you got to, that idea, and that also that frame of adding that the actual experiments, not just the research, but that you were really looking to get the data for that. And that's something I've always really appreciated, even when we might try a new class or new workshop, like where's the learning value, not just the revenue value as well. So I always appreciate that. So Jason, now that you've decided, and if we're in July, what has been the last couple of months in terms of you made the decision? Then how did you go about kind of project planning? And you mentioned about partners, like in
Yep.
terms of like locating platform requirements, et cetera.
Yeah. So we were formulating the experiments and running them. Really, it was like February, March, April. Start like into May. And it was sometime in early May where I felt like we had enough data back, and this idea of the community was sort of forming. And I started to test that idea with a handful of people, clients and colleagues and things like that. And the reaction I was getting was like, yes, this makes a lot of sense. So now the job was to figure out, okay, so I have this idea, which is to build a community. Like, how do you do that? Like, how does one build a community? And I think this is where my sort of habit of continuous learning and I was really excited. I was like, I have no idea where do I even start? Uh, and that was not daunting to me. That was exciting. So I was like, started to read uh, everything that I could find about, especially businesses or idea based communities, like people who have built a community around an idea or playing an idea, and very helpfully, people have written about their experiences trying to do this. So like it wasn't hard to find things, find other people's experiences, and
And
then
was this literally just like Google search, or were you going to certain publications?
yeah, it was good. I was getting publications from my Google searches, but it was primarily Google search. I will say that in the background, I did make good liberal use of AI to like keep track of notes and ideas that I was coming
Mhm.
across as I was going. So I was like building up um, essentially like a background document, as well as like the early stages of a strategy, just by dumping ideas into a conversation with, in this case, Chat GPT. So I was like dumping all of this information in there, and like kind of keeping a record of what I was learning. And what became clear to me was that we had a choice to make. Like there are lots of different types of communities. I knew that we wanted this community to have at least like a big part of this community to have an online component. And that now, like my job was to figure out, okay, how do you build an online component or an online sort of place for a community? And there were a handful of options. One of them was like, make it yourself, build your own like tool or set of tools to build a community. One of them was use an existing platform. And there are loads of different like types of platforms for communities. And so that began my investigation of like, what tool do we want to use to build a community? And to do that investigation, I had to come up with a set of evaluation criteria. And my evaluation criteria were, one, does the platform that we choose, does this tool that we're choosing natively support the types of interaction that people said they wanted, right? People said, I want to have access to experts, I want to have access to my peers, I want to be able to have real conversations with people about putting these ideas into practice. And then, does the platform allow us to generate revenue? Like, does it make it easy for us to build new revenue streams on top of those experiences? And that it became pretty obvious pretty quickly that some of the really sort of hot places to have a community weren't the best for us. So, for example, like lots of people are building communities on Discord and Slack. And Discord and Slack, in some ways, they make the types of experiences we wanted to build easy, but in a lot of ways, they make them kind of hard, actually. This idea of holding like an office hours or whatever, it's pretty clunky in those communities from my perspective. And so that eliminated a lot of these like really cool, like hip new community tools, and got us back to this idea of like a core online community, similar, like people might have participated in a message board or something like that, but there are new versions of that layer on top of it these like really cool social interactions, live experiences, as well as the ability to access courses and content resources and things like that. And yeah, I tested a whole bunch of them out for myself. I tried to build sample communities on each of those platforms. I spoke with salespeople at each of these companies, and eventually we landed on partnering with a company called Circle to host the community, who satisfied our requirements, but also I thought they were really great to work with throughout the sales process. It gave me a lot of confidence that they were going to be helpful to us in the process of building the community.
So, just to summarize again what I heard, because again, I think, Jason, this is, at least for me, it's really helpful, and we're hoping it's helpful for you all as you think about projects. Like the first big ticket item of like data and research was stuff that you're very familiar with. You've done a lot of it, so you could both lead the experiments and get data from the experiments, as well as the actual surveys and research. And those are things that you've over your career very sort of well schooled in. The second one was like, okay, we've made the decision, and now I need this potential like community, and that was something that was actually new to you. And I think that's important to highlight. Like in a project, there might be so many different pieces, and some of it you might be familiar with, and some of it was new. And so, you talked about how you always love continuous learning, but like, what would you say to someone if they feel like, oh my gosh, now I need to do this thing? And I don't know, like you were researching and
Yep.
creating your, AI conversation, but do you have any other tips on someone who maybe isn't wired quite like you in terms of that continuous learning chip that you have?
Yeah. The only thing I would say is like, if I found that I was not excited by the prospect of trying to like understand this space,
Hmm.
and do the research and learning on my own, I would have turned instead to I would have tried to find an expert, like someone who, for example, had started a community recently, and had found and there I will say one of the nice things about wanting to build a community is that it turns out community builders like to be in communities also. So there are a lot of
Very
real, I mean,
meta.
it's, I mean, it seems it's obvious sort of saying it, right? But like, there's a lot of people who are very, over the course of this journey, have been very generous, either with me directly, like spending their time
Hmm.
talking to me about their experiences, or indirectly by documenting their experiences, by
Yeah.
releasing. There's like great video content, as well as written content that I found about this. And then for the people, when I found something that I thought was especially interesting, like I would often just reach out to the person and say like, hey, I saw this thing that you made, like I had another question about it. And I think to a person, like everybody responded to me.
That is really amazing, and also I think part of the spirit of what we're trying to do with Radical Candor, and it feels like it's a very similar spirit of collaboration and co-creation and community. One thing, Jason, that you've also been doing in this project that I wanted to highlight because I really appreciate it is that you have been sharing invites for planning calls and recordings of these calls like in a Slack channel for this project. So if people want to be included, obviously everyone's really busy, but really including the team, but not requiring it. So I think there's some learning there too. What was on your mind with that?
I feel like there was a lot of work that I got the input of from experts like these other people that built communities, and that gave me really good basis to make the decision about the platform. But then in my mind, like that's when the real work began, which was to figure out, okay, like what type of community we want to build on top of this platform.
Hmm.
And I didn't want to make those choices entirely on my own. Like that was the place where I wanted to lean on the collective wisdom of the team. And so I chose a couple of different ways of communicating about this. So one way I chose to communicate about it was live. So we have team meetings, and there are a handful of team meetings where I talked about, hey, here's the idea that we're working on. Here are some proposals that I have, and just asking people for their feedback in the moment, as well as encouraging people to reach out to me if they had any other ideas. Another way was like through asynchronous updates. So we have a habit of a sort of ritual in the company where that I restarted relatively recently in the last 3 months or so, which is this sort of like Friday update where we take a moment to sort of reflect on the week and what's been happening. And I was making sure, like as I was making decisions or coming up with new information about this, that I was posting in my Friday update, like, hey, here's what I was thinking about this week, or here's the decision that's coming up, or here's something new that I learned about the community thing, and I was posting it in those asynchronous updates. And then the last thing that I did was I built a Slack channel that contained some other asynchronous updates, but most importantly, it contained I've been pushing all of the communication that I have about this project, whether that's through email or meetings, etc. I've been pushing all the communication through there. Oh, I should say that's the second and last thing. And the final thing that I did was like for any meeting where major decisions are going to be made, I made a commitment to the team to make sure that those meetings were visible to them and that they were to let them know that they were welcome to join if they had time, and that I would do my best to prepare them for what the conversation in that meeting was going to be about, so that they could join and share their perspective productively in that discussion.
Yeah, and just as one example, I was on vacation for a couple days and you had put in that channel a recording and all the different information and also being very clear like, hey, we are coming to a point where certain decisions need to be made. And so having that understanding of the deadline and what you were looking for from the feedback was really helpful. So I could participate even though I was out at that time. Um, Before we close, again, we are uh, in early July. We're probably a month or so out, Jason, from what you would call a soft launch. But right now, based on what you're intending, how are our listeners going to be able to get involved?
So I always like to under promise and over deliver, but I'm going to push myself out of my comfort zone here. I think this is going to be an amazing experience. There are just like viscerally, there are so many situations where we run into people, at workshops or on social media or in conversation where people are like, I mean, where can I go to learn more about this and I think when I thought about the audience for this, I was thinking about both aspiring people leaders as well as experienced people leaders, because my goal is to build a community that's like teaching each other and teaching us, right?
Hmm.
I think that there's like I have a humility about this, that we're going to learn a lot about how to better teach Radical Candor, how to make sure that Radical Candor remains relevant over time from the contributions of the community.
Jason, what would success for this project look like for you, both kind of quantitative, but maybe even more important, qualitative?
Yeah, I have I have what I think to be like pretty modest goals quantitatively. Like I would like to get 1,000 people to sign up for the community this year. We have a big audience, the podcast audience. We get almost 100,000 downloads a month of podcast episodes. That's huge audience. We have hundreds of thousands of followers between our various social media accounts. Uh, uh, but I think a great community starts with a small set of motivated, committed people who are excited about the idea of helping others stress less, build better relationships, and get more done. Right? Like that's really what we want. We want people to believe in that mission and to join us on this journey in both like providing direct help to one another, but also providing feedback and input to us, like to the creators of the community, so that we can be better stewards of it. Like that's really what. Um, so quantitative, 1,000 members by the end of this year. Qualitative, a group of people who are excited about contributing to this community of learning, both by helping each other and by giving us the feedback we need to be effective in helping the community to sustain itself in the long run.
Is there anything I haven't asked you that you wish I had asked or that you
Mm,
feel like you haven't had a chance to reflect on?
that's a great question. This is a little bit less about where we've been so far and more about where we're going. One of the really great pieces of feedback that I've received so far about not just what we're trying to do, but about the challenges of building community, especially online, really boils down to this idea of, for Radical Candor, for a community committed to helping managers be better at their job, there's this sort of baked in assumption that people need to be vulnerable, right? They need to say, I'm struggling with something. And people have
Mhm.
demonstrated their willingness to be vulnerable sort of anonymously or pseudo anonymously when they send their questions in to the podcast email, right? Like they're willing to do
Yeah.
that. Um, and I think that we're set up for success because Kim uh, does this incredibly well, right? It's core to the way that she presents the ideas of Radical Candor, which is to talk about the mistakes that she's made and how
Mhm.
those mistakes and acknowledging those mistakes he- helps her want to get it right in the future. Um, but also, provides that the humility that comes from acknowledging those mistakes provides the foundation for being able to practice radical candor, because you don't assume in every conversation that you're right. Right, that's like this foundational idea, is that success comes from learning something, not necessarily from the being the one who was right. uh, and I think building a community that really embraces that and reinforces that's going to be a real challenge. I think there's a tendency on the internet to get into various forms of pissing matches about who's right and who's wrong, and I think that will cause. Um, I think if that spirit of discourse were to take hold in this community, it would kill it. Um, and so that's the thing that like is most on my mind is, how do we build, so on top of the ideas and the resources, how do we build the right sort of like guardrails and rituals that help
Mhm.
reinforce the idea, that really celebrate that sort of that kind of vulnerable sharing, and reinforce the idea that the way that we learn is by talking about our mistakes and our successes, but by vulnerably and clearly talking about our mistakes. I think that's going to be uh, a perennial challenge of running a community like this, because ultimately what we want, right, is we want people, we want the aspiring manager to get that promotion that they want, right? We want to
Yep.
prepare them and make sure that they get the promotion to manager that they're looking for. And for the experienced manager, maybe they don't need our help. Maybe what they really need is the opportunity to mentor somebody else, and we want to give them that opportunity also. We're hoping that this community becomes a place for that. Or maybe they're looking to make the step from, manager to executive. And I'd love
Mm-hmm.
this community to be a place that helps people take a step in the direction of their dreams. And in order to do that, I think we need to build this place of safety for like talking vulnerably about the really difficult things that we run into. So that's the challenge that I think is like most on my mind. I think this is
Mm-hmm.
overcomable. There are lots of communities that do this really well and do this successfully, but that's why I think to some extent that drives down. I think that it'd be easy to say, oh, we want 1 million member. You know what I'm saying? We want 1 million people to join the community. But I think I'd prefer to have a smaller community that really embodies the core spirit of Radical Candor and supports one another in their growth and development. I'd rather start small and be successful at that, and then use the learning, the success from that success to build the community bigger, to scale it up.
So here's our Radical Candor checklist, and these are tips to start putting Radical Candor into practice. Tip number 1, when you're starting a new project, you're not sure how to accomplish a goal, start with experiments. Have an experimenter's mindset and start with some small experiments that are going to help you learn more about where to go next.
Tip number 2, get excited to be wrong. It's really easy to get attached to an idea as you're starting to explore like a new product or offering. And the whole point of the experiments is to produce data. And in an ideal world, the data will show you where you are wrong. And at this stage, it's super helpful to be wrong early in a project. So it's helpful to reframe data that shows that you're moving down the wrong path as like a really exciting chance to avoid spending a bunch of resources doing something that would eventually fail.
Tip number 3, Project Pioneer, know thyself. When you are doing something new, are you the kind of person like Jason who's going to go off and read and research on your own? Is this something new to you? Do you need some expert advice or guidance? Or are you someone maybe more like me who loves to collaborate and wouldn't do so well if you were having a lonely solo march of project planning? So know yourself. And if you are someone who likes to learn on your own, don't ignore expert advice. Jason, do you have anything more to add on that? Any expert advice about ignoring expert advice?
I think you nailed it. I think as
Okay.
long as you are willing to accept it, you're on the right track. The scariest part, tips 1 through 3, are really like, don't be arrogant. Like if I was to try to sum them up, that's what tips 1 through 3 really say is don't be arrogant. Like be willing to start small, be willing to be wrong, and take an approach that will work well for you and include the perspective of others.
Which leads you nicely into tip number 4.
Yes, don't forget that you are almost certainly part of a team. Even if that team is very small, at some point you need to make sure that the rest of your team knows not only what you're doing, but why you're doing it. And so pick a communication plan that allows your team to stay up to date on what is going on, that makes clear what the goals are, and gives them each an opportunity to provide input into the process at those moments when their input is going to have the biggest impact. So think anytime you need to make a big decision in the the product or project that you're working on, you should be soliciting the guidance from your team.
For more tips and the show notes for this episode, you can find them at radicalcandor.com/podcast. Praise in public, criticize in private. And so if you like what you hear, please do rate and review wherever you're listening. And if you've got criticism for us, you can email it. We love to hear it. podcast@radicalcandor.com. Bye for now.
Take care.
The Radical Candor podcast is based on the book Radical Candor, Be a Kick-Ass Boss Without Losing Your Humanity by Kim Scott. Episodes are written and produced by Brandy Neal with script editing by me, Amy Sandler. The show features Radical Candor co-founders Kim Scott and Jason Rosoff and is hosted by me. Still Amy Sandler. Nick Carissimi is our audio engineer. The Radical Candor podcast theme music was composed by Cliff Goldmacher. Follow us on LinkedIn, Radical Candor the company, and visit us at radicalcandor.com.